I was not allowed to play Yu-Gi-Oh in Japan. I made a tweet a couple of days ago that went semi-viral on Twitter where I showed up to a card store, a locals in Japan, expecting to be able to play, and I was unfortunately turned down for not being able to speak Japanese. Since then, there's been a lot more information that's come to light, and there's also been a lot of misinformation on both sides. So I wanted to make this video to clarify that as well as any misunderstandings so we can talk about what exactly happened. Now, in my original tweet, I basically said that I showed up to a locals and they told me that I was not allowed to play locals because I did not speak Japanese. From there, I went to another card store in the same area and I asked them about the tournaments, where they replied to me that they did not actually have Yu-Gi-Oh tournaments. Now, this is where the first misconception happened, and this is entirely my fault. So the truth is, this store actually does not have tournaments. And I made this assumption because they're a large Yu-Gi-Oh store that dedicates nearly half of their store to actually selling Yu-Gi-Oh cards, as well as the fact that they had tables and players are actually playing Yu-Gi-Oh on them. But in hindsight, it was completely wrong to make that conclusion. And admittedly, I was a bit emotional just coming off the fact that the first store told me I couldn't enter. So that is 100% on me. And I do apologize for making that assumption. So the next part of the tweet isn't directly related to Yu-Gi-Oh, but the next day I did go and try and find a sushi place to have some dinner. Now, upon entering, the chef asked me if I spoke Japanese, and when I replied no, he told me to leave and that it was Japanese only. So this is where the dominoes started to tumble in my head, and I started to feel a little bit like I was being discriminated. Number one, being turned away from the Yu-Gi-Oh tournament for not speaking Japanese, and then number two, making that assumption, unfortunately, which added to all of this. And then number three, being turned away at a Japanese restaurant for not speaking Japanese. And I think at the end of the day, all of this boils down to the fact that I was obviously brought up in a Western culture where for me, it's just completely out of left field. If someone came to an establishment somewhere in North America or Europe and didn't speak English and wanted to play Yu-Gi-Oh or to go to a restaurant and eat something and to be turned away, for me, that's something that's just completely out of line. And I'm sure a lot of people from the Western regions would agree. It's just not something we do. We're just used to welcoming everyone, no matter what their background is or what their disabilities are, or if they don't speak a language, for example. So all of that is kind of what pushed me to make that tweet on Twitter and to be admittedly quite upset about the entire situation. Now, with that context out of the way, I think we should revisit the first situation because that's the one that is really relevant to what the entire topic is of being not able to play Yu-Gi-Oh because I didn't speak Japanese. So to go a little bit more into detail, this is exactly the timeline that happened. On day zero, I made a tweet asking if anyone had any recommended card stores to visit because I would be traveling to Tokyo for a couple of days. I got some recommendations on Twitter saying that there were some cool stores in the radio tower of Akihabara that dealt specifically with Yu-Gi-Oh. So the next day I go to said radio tower in Akihabara. They had a lot of different Yu-Gi-Oh stores across the different floors selling singles, selling different cards, older cards, older vanillas that I picked up on. Is honestly a great experience. They had some amazing display of singles that I've never seen before anywhere else, any store in America or Europe. I've never seen anything like it, where they literally have all the singles on display throughout large panes of glass. It was actually amazing. Now, I do want to point out that I did not actually know that it was illegal or disrespectful to take photos of a card store or any products that they were displaying for that matter in Japanese culture. In Western culture, we're just used to taking photos of things that we find cool that's out in the public. And I think the perception of privacy is different than how it is portrayed in Japan. But I now understand that this is something very sensitive. So moving forward, of course, I'm going to be asking permission before doing that. I also had photos of the store clerk as well as players actually playing in the second store and left them uncensored because I thought the face masks were already censorship. But I've since realized this is not the case and I definitely should have censored them out. The only reason why I took those photos was to provide proof and evidence of my claims. So I eventually make my way to the store where I see a tournament going on. And as excited as I was, I spoke to the store clerk and asked him if I could participate in Yu-Gi-Oh tournaments. He then asked me if I was able to communicate in Japanese. And when I told him that I could not, we had a little bit of back and forth. And I did tell him over Google Translate that I was familiar with the cards. I had taken some time to research them and that I could communicate at least on a basic understanding of Japanese for the actual actions within the game. For example, Shokan referring to summoning or Koka for the effects. Which brings me to my second misconception that I see a lot of people actually talking about on Twitter. And because this has reached the general populace of Twitter, a lot of people maybe don't understand how competitive Yu-Gi-Oh actually works. And this is actually the fact that at a competitive Yu-Gi-Oh level, all of the players generally know what cards do just by their pictures. In fact, you should know at least 90 to 95% of the card pool and what cards, decks, and combos actually do if you want to enter a Yu-Gi-Oh tournament and do well. And being someone that indulges in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh and follows the metagame, I actually took a lot of extra time to research the cards that were out in the OCG and were not yet released in the TCG. So all of the cards from Infinite Forbidden or from the Duelist pack, the side sets that they had, for example, the Gimmick Puppet cards, the Millennium cards, the Fiendsmith cards, a lot of stuff coming out from Infinite Forbidden, as well as the Duelist Pack side sets. I made sure to take a lot of time to study their card effects, to know exactly what they did, at least from a surface level, just by looking at their pictures and the general combo line, so I knew how to interact with them without actually having to pick up the card and read it. I also spent a lot of time actually reviewing OCG footage that I generally do anyways to have a better understanding of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, knowing that OCG actually gets the cards before us and we can actually learn a thing or two from them because they had ample time to test the cards before we do. And of course, trigger effects being the other big one. In the TCG, trigger effects have to be the first thing that takes place in a closed game state generally, but in the OCG, you can actually chain trigger effects to quick effects. So you can actually use quick effects before trigger effects. So for example, if you had a card like Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill, you could actually use that on your turn as Chain Link 2 in response to a monster being special summoned and activating its quick effect. Whereas in the TCG, Ghost Mourner would have to be Chain Link 1 because it's a trigger effect, which is spell speed 1. Same kind of deal with cards like Phantasme. If you had like a Prank Kids card that you linked off for Meow Mew and use the effect, what you can actually do in the OCG is you can use the effect of Ash Blossom to negate that effect from special summoning and also chain Phantasme on top of that. Whereas in the TCG, you would have to have Phantasme being Chain Link 1, meaning you would be chain blocked from using Ash Blossom Joy's Spring. Same kind of deal with phase shifts. Trigger effects the turn player could actually prioritize and be Chain Link 1 for a Sky Striker Shizuku in the end phase. So your opponent can actually use a quick effect before you're able to activate Shizuku as Chain Link 1. I know this is a thing in Master Duel for some time as well. So just like key differences there. I actually took a lot of time to brush up on and made sure that I was aware of the differences between the OCG and the TCG. Because obviously I'm going to play in a foreign territory. I should definitely take the time to do my due diligence so I do not run into awkward situations, especially with the language barrier in mind. So the misconception that I would actually have to whip out Google Translate for every single card and waste unnecessary time is actually the contrary. I had what I felt like a generally good understanding of what the OCG metagame was, the popular decks, the card effects, and all of the major differences between the TCG and the OCG. I then asked him, am I allowed to use my TCG cards? Because I brought my TCG cards from America, and I did add a couple of OCG cards from the store that I purchased for that deck. He replies to me, unfortunately not, because it's an official Konami sanctioned event. It does have to be all Japanese OCG cards. Now, this is completely fine. Obviously, in TCG, we're not able to use OCG cards. In OCG, you're not able to use TCG cards for the official sanctioned Konami events. And I already knew this, but I wanted to double check with him before I actually invested money in an OCG deck that I could basically only use for the duration of the trip. So after hearing that I'm not able to use my TCG deck, I go to the store and I order the entire Tenpai deck. And honestly, OCG cards are not that expensive. You can get the whole deck basically less than 200. I would say like closer to $150. You get the whole entire Tenpai deck with basically every card that you'd ever want. Cards like Trident Dragon that are $80 to $90 in the TCG are only around $7 to $10 US in the OCG. So I have no problem with this, obviously. I go and buy the whole OCG deck from the store, and then I assemble my deck using sleeves. I asked the store clerk when the next tournament is because this tournament for the day had already started. I arrived pretty late. They started the tournament somewhere around 2:30, and I arrived at around 5:30. It was my first day in Akihabara, and just basically taking the time to more explore than actually wanting to play in the tournament, but I did want to ask for some information. So after sleeving my deck, I go home, I take the entire deck. I'm really excited. The next day, I'm thinking I'm going to come back at around 2:30 to play in a local tournament. Now, this is where another misconception actually comes in, where people were thinking that this was for the WCQ, for the Japanese qualifiers that would lead to Japanese nationals and then the World Championship qualifier, which was obviously only restricted for Japanese citizens. This is not the case. The WCQ tournament actually took place on the Saturday, and when I came back on the second day, this is actually the Friday where they would have a regular ranking tournament, aka locals, at 2:30. And Konami had previously released rules saying that you can only partake in those if you're a Japanese citizen, which makes total, like, perfect sense, right? Like, it doesn't make sense that a foreigner would go in to a WCQ and try and qualify and play for Japan. That's just completely irrational, and I totally understand that. But I just wanted to play in a regular local tournament, which is why I went back on Friday at 2:30 to try and play in the tournament with my full OCG deck. And this is where the actual situation arose that led to the Twitter post. So I show up at the store again, and this time it's a different store clerk. So I asked the gentleman, am I able to enter the tournament? Mind you, this is around 2 o'clock, so about half an hour before the tournament started. There was no one at the tables. The store was pretty empty, and he actually had the bandwidth to stop and talk to me. He asked me if I speak Japanese, so I shake my head saying, no, I don't. And that's when he whips out his phone for Google Translate, realizing that I'm not from Japan and I don't speak the same language. He then asked me if I could communicate with the other players, knowing that I don't speak Japanese. And I tell him basically the same thing I told the other clerk the previous day, in that I understand the game and I can communicate on a basic level for the actual card game, and that there'd be no problem actually playing the game. Now, he was extremely hesitant. There was a lot of back and forth. We probably went back and forth on Google Translate for about 15-20 minutes. And the whole time I was keeping my cool and being very transparent with him. I was a little shocked, to say the least, that I was being denied for the language barrier, because I've never had that happen. So after going back and forth for about 20 minutes, he finally said, okay, you can try to enter the tournament if you have a Neuron Japanese account, which I did not, but unfortunately there was just not enough time to do it. So the tournament fired off, but he did hand me a schedule for the store, as well as let me know that there'd be a Konami person coming later to run some casual duels, and I could definitely participate in that. And some people on Twitter were saying this is entitled behavior, but again, with the extra context and the fact that the tournament would not be held up, I think there's some room for reconsideration. This is where another misconception has come up on Twitter, where people think that Yu-Gi-Oh is such a communication-based game. And yes, it is at a casual level, but again, at a competitive level where you're going to tournaments, you still understand all of the cards, and this is not something that's new. We already have this in the TCG. In Europe, there are a lot of different countries. People do not necessarily speak English or German or French, and they still participate in the same tournaments. In Belgium, for example, they speak both German and French. So at their nationals, there are German players who do not speak French and vice versa, but they're still able to play fundamentally by pointing to the card, by revealing card effects, and just knowing how card effects interact with each other. It's very easy to play this game without actually communicating verbally what is going on. And in the rare circumstances where you actually do need a translation for a card, or you do have some sort of dispute, you do have Google Translate. Like, this is something that can be easily solved in less than 60 seconds by just showing your opponent typing something really quick. And this is not something that's going to happen for every single play or every single card that's going to be played on the battlefield, because players generally know what cards do. The same thing has also happened to tournaments in Latin America, where players might be traveling to Brazil and not speak Portuguese, or traveling to a country that speaks Spanish and they only speak English. So there's a language barrier, but they're still able to play. We've had tons of players actually go down to YCS to do that. But there are, of course, people in the Twitter replies that are saying YCSs cannot be compared to locals because they have more resources, more judges that can help. But the truth is, that's just not true, because the judges don't necessarily help. Again, the players are able to solve this among themselves, and in the worst possible scenario, they can just use Google Translate to talk to each other. It's no different than it would be at a locals. You don't need the extra resources or the judges to actually help you. Players just know what cards do at the top level of Yu-Gi-Oh! And I totally understand, like, if I did not understand any of the card effects, if I had to read everything, if I had to try and talk to my opponent, if I had to translate everything, of course that would be a nuisance. That would be unfair to the rest of the players there. But the truth is, that's just not the case when you do actually play competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Everyone just knows the card effects. Now, of course, with the language barrier, there's no way the store clerk would have known that. He might have thought that I would have had to translate every card, I wouldn't know how to read the cards, and it would have held up the game. So that's completely valid. But at the same time, what it boils down to is, I feel like morally and logically, if a player wanted to participate in something like Yu-Gi-Oh! And they didn't speak your language, at least in Western culture, we would definitely do anything that was possible to make them feel included. We've had a lot of Chinese and Japanese players that don't speak English, for example, in my locals, that have come to our locals and played, and everyone just welcomes them and are happy and patient to work with them so they have a chance at playing. Honestly, it just doesn't sit well with me thinking, if the roles were reversed, if this was in USA or Canada and a player from Japan came and tried to play in our locals, but he had the full TCG deck. He was very excited to play, and we told them, nope, you don't speak English. This is only for English speaking customers because you're going to cause a nuisance for the rest of the players and the staff. We just don't have the time to deal with that. So you just can't play in the tournaments. I'm sorry. But again, they're a visitor. I feel like we should make them welcome more than anything. And I've never ever seen anyone get turned away for not speaking a language or something that was well beyond their control in the moment. I understand there's a cultural difference between Japan and America, for example, but still, morally speaking, I feel like no one should be disincluded, especially from a community, a tight knit community of what is essentially a children's card game. Right. This is not something that's super serious. There's no money on the line. This is just something that we're trying to do to have fun at the end of the day. And I even said that to the store clerk. I'm just trying to have fun at the end of the day. At one point, I even told them, my opponents can have all the wins. I just want to try and play Yu Gi Oh! Now, since I posted this on Twitter, there's also been some people pointing out in the actual official Konami Japanese rules, the OCG rules, that says you need an actual permanent Japanese address, as well as the ability to communicate in Japanese on a basic level in order to be able to participate in the tournament. And I was actually surprised. I did not know that this was a rule. So perhaps the store clerk actually knew about this, but he just didn't have a way of conveying this to me. Or maybe he was just following orders from his higher ups at the store. So I don't necessarily fault him on a personal level. And this was no way, shape, or form any attempt to start a witch hunt on him personally. Now, that being said, a lot of other Twitter users have said that they've participated in other shop locals in Japan as a foreigner who doesn't necessarily speak good Japanese. So, in hindsight, I think I definitely overreacted a little bit in some of the wording in the original tweet, saying that, you can't really play Yu Gi Oh! In Japan. That's not necessarily the case. It's more and more sounding like it was an isolated incident for me specifically, and I got a little bit unlucky. Now, this is where the additional context actually comes in because I had a couple of people reach out. These were people that were actually present at the store or had been to the store in the past to play in their store local tournaments. So, one user actually told me that previously, in a couple of weeks prior to when I was there were a group of Chinese duelists who were foreigners as well that were actually playing in the tournament and were speaking among themselves in Chinese while they were dueling, potentially even giving hints to each other, but more so the fact that it's just downright disrespectful when you're dueling someone and they're talking to someone behind their back in a different language. So apparently that was an incident at the store that caused a bit of a kerfuffle with the actual store clerks and the judges. And then another user actually reached out and told me that he himself was a foreigner who went to their store previously, and he actually had an incident with a Japanese player at the store where he had his side deck in his deck box and then tried to pull out his side deck during the duel. And the Japanese player actually called a judge saying that he would not be allowed to use the side deck because it was not presented on the table at the beginning of the duel and it was in his deck box. And that the Japanese player forced him to use rock, paper, scissors instead of rolling a dice, for example, to determine who started off the duel. He told me that the store actually sided with the Japanese player and there was a bit of a scene because he was understandably unhappy, just being a locals that something like that would even happen and someone would call a judge for that. Now, I don't know the validity of the story of either of these stories, obviously, but these were brought to my attention and they actually sent proof of them participating in the tournament on Neuron. So, from what I gather, these two incidents combined with potentially other incidents that involved foreigners, potentially causing a scene in the tournaments, maybe led to the store clerk being a little hesitant. Now, with those incidents in mind, it might have not completely been his fault because, if a foreigner is always causing issues in the tournament, in addition to the potential language barrier, I can totally see why he'd be a little apprehensive to allow me to participate in the tournament. So I was actually a little surprised to see a lot of users actually defending this on Twitter and saying that it was okay just because it was how Japanese culture has always been. For me, this is something that I feel like should be reconsidered because at the end of the day, it's a game. But I know there are both sides to this, so I do want to hear you guys' thoughts in the comments below and let me know what you think as a whole. That's about it. I think I touched upon all the points that were outlined in the Twitter thread and some of the replies. From here, I just want to move on from this because I feel like I've kind of said my piece. And if there are some cultural differences, unfortunately, that's just the way it is right now. But at least from a Western perspective, I'm just happy to know that we would definitely welcome anyone, even if they did not speak English, to play Yu Gi Oh! With us.